Hello, everyone. Welcome to City Lights Live. City Lights Live is the virtual reading series that follows the footsteps of our in-store events calendar. Of course, City Lights Live is housed by City Lights Books and Publishers, which is located in the historic neighborhood of North Beach in San Francisco, California. My name is Jonathan Bingham. I'm one of the booksellers at City Lights. I'm also a working composer here in the San Francisco Bay Area, so you can imagine my enthusiasm for tonight's event. This event is a celebration of two things. One, it's the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, founded on Chicago's South Side in 1965 and still thriving today. The AACM is the most influential collective organization in jazz and experimental music. The second is Sound Experiments, which was written by Paul Steinbeck. In Sound Experiments, Paul offers an in-depth historic and musical investigation of the AACM, analyzing individual performances and formal innovations in captivating detail. Paul Steinbeck is the Associate Professor of Music at Washington University in St. Louis. He is the author of Message to Our Folks, the Art Ensemble of Chicago, and co-author of Exercises for the Creative Musician. Our facilitator for this evening will be Richard Scheinin. He is the staff writer for SF Jazz. Richard has written for GQ and Rolling Stone, and is the author of Field of Screams, The Dark Underside of America's National Pastime, a historic baseball story. During his 25 plus year base at the Mercury News, his work has been submitted for Pulitzer Prizes, reporting on religion, classical music, and jazz. If you did not know these names before tonight's event, I can assure you that their industries that they work in are very familiar with them. As a reminder, at the end of the event this evening, there will be a Q&A. I encourage everyone to switch to speaker view on their Zoom apps. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Paul. Thank you. Your presence is not taken lightly. Paul, please take it away.
Thanks so much for that warm introduction, Jonathan, and thanks to everyone at City Lights for inviting me to participate in this presentation tonight. I'm very excited to be here. City Lights is a legendary store, legendary publisher, and it's just good to be in this number. Thanks also to Richard for agreeing to be my conversation partner this evening. As Jonathan said, we're here to celebrate the AACM and to celebrate the publication of my book, Sound Experiments. The AACM needs no introduction in some sense, but maybe I do in relationship to the AACM. I spent several years living in Chicago where I was a budding musician, and I studied composition with a number of AACM members, including Wadada Leo and Ari Brown, took bass lessons from the great AACM bassist Harrison Bankhead, and also spent countless hours for years and years at Fred Anderson's Velvet Lounge, just learning from Fred Anderson, who was a founding member of the AACM, about, music and life. After my years in Chicago, I spent a long time in New York, where my principal teacher as a writer and researcher was another AACM member, George Lewis. So this book is very much a tribute to the AACM, an offering to them for what they've given to me and many, many other people. The AACM's mission has always been the development and fostering of individual voices as composers, as improvisers, as performers. And even though I'm not an AACM member, I consider myself to be part of the tradition, definitely a student protege of many AACM members, and as Anthony Braxton would say, a fellow friendly experiencer. So Sound Experiments, as I said, is an offering to the AACM. It's also a history of the organization, kind of a sonic history. So the way that the book unfolds, the way that the book is meant to work, is to tell the history of the AACM through the lens of 10 major pieces, 10 major compositions by AACM artists. So in hearing the stories behind these pieces, the people who made them, the performers, and everything that sort of surrounds these pieces, you learn also about the pivotal events in the history of the AACM, the formation of the experimental band under the direction of Muhal, Richard Abrams, the founding of the AACM itself in 1965, the sort of global spread of the AACM's creativity beginning in the late 60s. You learn about the AACM's rise to commercial success with major label record deals, important tours and performances. You learn about the establishment of the second AACM chapter, the one that's in New York City, as well as the revitalization of the Chicago chapter. You also learn about the AACM's rise to what it is right now, really, the center of jazz and experimental music for a lot of notable figures around the world, not just in Chicago, not just in New York, not just in the U.S. As the sort of history of the AACM unfolds in the book, you also get a sense, I think, of the books are, my sort of the perspective that I develop about the AACM's major musical contributions. So you get a sense of how AACM artists develop the practice of multi-instrumentalism, of playing little instruments. You begin to understand the AACM's unique contributions to musical notation and conducting and music technology, and many other things beyond that, especially unique ways of integrating composition and improvisation. So that's what I'm here to talk about. That's what you'll get if you read the book, and I hope you do. And I know you've been seeing messages to purchase the book in the chat, so do not neglect those links either. So with that said, just kind of a prelude for tonight, I'd like to invite Richard Scheinin into the conversation. He is my discussion partner for this evening. I think he may have some questions for me, some things he wants to maybe know a little bit more about, or things that you as the audience might be interested in. So please, Richard, jump in and tell me what's on your mind.
Okay. First of all, Paul, thank you for asking me to do this. I mean, I'm older than you, and the AACM has been important to me for like 50 years. When I was a kid, 19, 20, 21 years old, I did radio shows in New York at WKCR FM, the Columbia University station, and it was a very formative period for me. And I was just this awestruck kid who was meeting some of these people that you're writing about. So I got to be around Braxton and Leo Smith and Leroy Jenkins a bit. And I often loved the AACM's music. I was sometimes mystified by it, always intrigued by it. And I just wanted to say that your book, I mean, here I am, I've been exposed to this for like half a century. And as I read your book, it just clarifies the music in a way that I can almost hear it differently and get a sense of, oh, that's what these guys are doing. So anyway, it's a great book. I urge everybody listening to get it, to sign on to your website. You've got a whole audiovisual link where you can listen along to Paul's explications, analyses of the music. And okay, that's my little intro. So Paul, I wanted to begin by asking you to tell us more about yourself. And we spoke on the phone briefly last night, but I want to know sort of how you got to this point and to understand a little bit of the thrill it must have been for you as a young guy to be hanging out with these great creators, to be playing the bass with them. Maybe just give us the linkages, because it was sort of a chain reaction. You go to the University of Chicago, you've taken up the electric bass, you get into the great saxophonist Wadada Bowden's ensemble, and you take it from there.
Yeah, so that was, first of all, I tried to get in and I couldn't get in right away because I was definitely not ready. So I had to spend another year woodshedding, as musicians say. But yeah, once I got with Muhal, it really took off. He was very instrumental introducing me and the other members of this university ensemble into what the AACM was all about. And so some of that came through playing scores by Douglas Ewart and Wadada Leo Smith and Roscoe Mitchell and many, many others. And a lot of it also just comes through telling stories or just giving little nuggets right here that were so intriguing in the same way that a lot of this music intrigued you, during your college days. So I can tell you so many little stories about, Muhal saying, well, Malachi Favorites holds his bow like this, or, he does things like this. You might want to think about it. And all that just set me off on all these journeys and all this research. It was also, I think, important to be at the University of Chicago, not just because Wadada Bowden was there. There are many other institutions where AACM folks, are integral to music programs. You have, I think, 4 different AACM musicians have taught at Mills College in the Bay Area. You had Anthony Braxton there, and then for many, many years after that at Wesleyan, Wadada Leo Smith at Cal Arts and Bard College before that. So many places where AACM artists have had generations of students. But for me, at the University of Chicago, it was maybe even better because the AACM grew up on the South Side, and many of these important early, meetings and concerts and events took place right on campus. So I felt like I was kind of walking in, footsteps of some of these great artists who then would come back to campus or be in Chicago, and I get a chance to meet them. Wadada also helped, introduce me to so many people. He introduced me to Fred Anderson at the Velvet Lounge, and Joseph Jarman when Joseph would come to town, Roscoe Mitchell when Roscoe would come, and all these different people. So for me, it was, dipping into a world that was at once historical and very much of the present day. And that's really, part of the appeal of the AACM. You have, some great accomplishments very early on in the 1960s. And then in many cases, you still have some of these founding members, at their creative peak, even now, 50 plus years later. So it's something that's never ending when you investigate, because you have these, great musicians still composing new pieces, performing at a high level, doing everything that they do. So, but that connection at the University of Chicago with Wadada Bowden was really important for me. And I've gone on to become a regular collaborator with Wadada, performing in ensembles with him, composing pieces for him, and vice versa, him with me. So, and there are so many other people I could list, but I think he was really, who got me started going down this particular road, which I'm very happy to still be on.
Mm-hmm. And he's not really the most well-known of the AACM people, but like I was telling you last night, I really didn't know about him until around 77, and I saw him perform in New York, and I thought, wow, this guy is really stealing the show. It was a big AACM festival at Columbia University, and that's where I first saw him. So he sort of put you in touch with Ari Brown, the great saxophonist, and you studied composition with him, right? And then later on, you go to Columbia and you're studying with George Lewis, who guides you through your dissertation.
Yeah, so I just was fortunate to have one great AACM teacher after another for a period of about a decade, and that, I guess that was, that was enough. And I'm still learning, of course, but that's a long time to really get to learn from a great lineage of musicians and composers and teachers, so that's kind of my point of entry into this music. And then again, I'm still performing and collaborating with a lot of AACM players, although some of that is slow due to COVID. I hope to really get back out there with some of my heroes, in the months to come.
Mm-hmm. So let's move to kind of a bigger question, one that you spent 270 pages basically answering in your book, and you've alluded to.
Is the book that long?
I think
it's
it is.
Easy.
Yeah.
It's a quick read.
Goes fast, man.
It's delightful.
But why is the AACM so important? Maybe everybody who's tuned in here knows, but maybe some don't. Jonathan, in his introduction, quoted a little bit from your introduction. You called them the most significant collective organization in the history of jazz and experimental music. You say they developed an array of creative practices that revolutionized jazz and experimental music. There's something that's just so interesting is that it's kind of this homegrown neighborhood organization that went global, kind of viral, and now its ideas and practitioners are everywhere, and you're like an example of that. So, in a nutshell, why should we care about the AACM?
Well, for all the reasons that you just quoted me saying, but definitely we have a repertoire of musical techniques and sounds and styles that would not have come about or not have sounded the same way without the AACM, not just producing individuals, but working together to really, think and develop and continue to conceptualize. So there's that aspect of just a bunch of people who got together in the 60s and, created their own musical universe that still produces new ideas, new innovations, and as well as sustaining some of these early concepts. So right away, that's important. I would also say that in the context of the times and in context of the present day, this is an organization for African-American composers. And certainly back then, and maybe even now, there's a great need for people to work collectively when institutions aren't always going out and looking, for ways to support. So back then, it was almost unheard of for a Black composer to be presented in the sort of forums that AACM composers are now, presented in right now. The jazz world, which on some level was more open to African-American artists, was also not open to Black artists doing the specific things that AACM composers wanted to do. So I feel like at the beginning, the AACM was between two different worlds, both of which were kind of defined by musical style and race. And so they had to band together, as Steve McCall says, to do something, because otherwise it wouldn't be done if they weren't going to be the ones to do it. So I think for these sort of historical, culture, and social reasons, the AACM is also enormously important. And these, you can't separate the musical innovations without the people, from the people who produce them. You can't separate the people from, the history and the neighborhood and all that. So the AACM is important for a lot of different ways. And it's so striking that something that does have this sort of character of a community organization, in little corners of the South Side, becomes global almost right away and continues to, to resonate throughout the globe. Just a testament to the innovations of these early members and to, the generations that have followed and continue to do new and exciting things.
It's so interesting, the connections between geography and developments in this music. Incredible scenes that, in Philadelphia in the 50s and Detroit. A couple of years ago, I talked to Roscoe Mitchell when he was inducted into the National Endowment for the Arts kind of Hall of Fame as a jazz master. And I asked him, why do you think this happened in Chicago? And he said, well, it's kind of a do-it-yourself city. And he told this story about how when he was a kid, people would hang buckets outside the window in the winter, collect the snow, and make ice cream. So I was just wondering, why do you think, what is it about Chicago? What was going on in Chicago in the late 50s, early 60s that made this thing percolate and explode?
I mean, so many ways of answering that question. I think one thing you could say is that Chicago is kind of like the Midwestern equivalent of these sort of cosmopolitan port cities and, metropoles that have always produced some of the most interesting things in music or anything else. When you have a place like New Orleans, where people are coming in from all over the Caribbean, jazz happens. When you have places like Vienna, where people are coming in from all over the Austro-Hungarian Empire, classical music happens. All these things happen in places where there's a confluence of people, ideas, where there's energy flowing in. Chicago is very much like that, even though Chicago can sometimes feel like a small town. At the time when the AACM was coming to fruition, or at the time when the people who would go on to form the AACM were growing up, Chicago was this really one of the centers for the Great Migration, of African Americans from the South to the North. So when you think of cities that really transformed music in the 20th century in America, you think of places like Chicago and Detroit that were destinations for this migration. So Chicago is cosmopolitan in the same sort of way, but we're just dealing with sort of domestic migration rather than, something that crosses international borders necessarily. At the same time, Chicago is also a major city, and there's all kinds of influences and things coming in. Every week there's something new. So if you listen to people like Henry Threadgill or Malachi Favors, they'll tell about growing up in the 50s and 60s and going to Orchestra Hall and hearing what Fritz Reiner was bringing in, or going to hear the Guinean ballet do something interesting that inspired what they would do in the months and years to follow. So there was just a lot happening in Chicago. A lot of that has to do with the Great Migration. A lot of it has to do with Chicago just being a capital for the arts and for music especially. And then it just sort of happens, maybe because there's that DIY culture that Roscoe mentions. There was nobody really setting up industry opportunities for AACM members early on, so they definitely had to band together, and maybe that was all for the better, because they worked really, really hard in early years to create this musical world, as I alluded to earlier, and it continues to bear fruit. So that's maybe some indications of why Chicago. And there are so many great, I don't want to just give you AACM quotes. There are so many great stories about, about the character of Chicago, what this neighborhood feels like, what the weather feels like, so many possible explanations that kind of touch on more of the impressionistic things that Roscoe said. But it definitely, happened in Chicago in ways that it didn't even happen in Philadelphia, LA, Detroit, all these other places that were hotbeds for musical experimentation. And it's still going today, which is something that also none of these other, cities and collectives that you may be alluding to, can say. So very much something that's active in the present day. There's something special about Chicago, also something special about New York, where many of the AACM members eventually, resettled.
Yeah, let's talk about a couple of the key figures who are given whole chapters in your book. Tell us about Muhal Richard Abrams. I mean, this guy comes up as a bebop piano player. He's friends with Charles Stepney. I'm just regurgitating what you already have written. You know, we know Stepney as this guy who went on produced Minnie Riperton and Earth, Wind and Fire, but he introduces Muhal to the Schillinger system of musical composition, which has this big effect on Muhal. So just tell us about Muhal and the experimental band. When I read about this band, first rehearsing in '62, everybody came out of it. It's sort of like Chicago's version of Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. It just nurtured and catapulted so many great artists. Okay, so
Yeah.
Muhal.
Yeah, that experimental band is just the lineup is just scary, you know, and even into the 70s when you kind of had the next iteration of that, the AACM big band, the lineup, just like the saxophone section, is mind-blowing to see who was playing in these groups. So Muhal was enormously influential, as anyone in AACM circles can tell you. He was one of the 4 co-founders of the AACM, but he was also the one that sort of stuck around in a leadership role in the organization the longest. And he continued to be a leader in the New York side of the organization until he passed a few years ago. So he was enormously influential. A lot of the musicians who came into the experimental band in 1962 and after were just a little bit younger than him. And so they ended up looking to Muhal, who was the band leader, for a lot of, instruction, a lot of sort of conceptual inspiration. And Muhal provided that. He was already an excellent bebop pianist, already an excellent composer, partially informed by just his schooling in Chicago's jam sessions on the South Side, but also someone who had gotten really deep into the Schillinger method. And he was able to give just little bits of information, little bits of inspiration that seemed to have been enormously influential for these musicians in his circle. So they talk about Muhal not only as someone who taught them composition, but also painting or herbology or astrology or esoteric philosophy. It seemed like anything that these fellow young people on the South Side were into, Muhal was just a repository for information and inspiration. So he was so influential early on, and he encouraged people to find their own way. And that's one thing I think that's characteristic of a lot of teachers in the AACM, not just Muhal, people like Fred Anderson, people like Wadada Leo, people like Anthony Braxton. These people as teachers did not produce clones. As great as that would have been, I would love to see a world with 50 Muhals, 50 Braxtons, but they produced people who went off then and went in their own directions, were inspired by, were influenced by what their teachers did, by what their elders did, but completely, developed their own styles as composers, as instrumentalists. And so I think that sort of tone setting, culture establishing was just as important, a contribution to Muhal as anything he did individually as a composer, as a leader of the experimental band. Just encouraged, people to develop their own styles, develop their own approaches. And I think that led to the great profusion of, sort of musical and conceptual diversity that you still see today in the AACM.
And he insisted on everyone composing, and every rehearsal was just original music, right?
Yeah, and that's really stunning to think about how much music he and the other members of the experimental band were just churning out on a weekly basis. In the AACM history written by George Lewis, A Power Stronger Than Itself, people quoted in that book just marvel at how he was doing all these different things throughout the week, and he would still have a new substantial composition for those weekly rehearsals of the experimental band. And the other members were writing a lot of music too. And I've found from my own experience performing in certain groups that once you have that kind of culture set, there's also this, it can be competitive sometimes, it can be collaborative sometimes, but you just want to keep raising the bar every week with your creativity. And that's definitely something that Muhal established. He was going to bring it every week. You should probably bring it too. Even if you weren't bringing a chart to the rehearsal, you should still be prepared to, get your horn out of the case and play very well, take a great solo, workshop these pieces, offer suggestions, and so this collective atmosphere is what Muhal really set up and really established. And, very influential, very inspirational for everyone who was around at the time. And people decades later who maybe never met Muhal or met him only in passing, still get those stories and still get that type of mentorship, from the culture that he established.
Mm-hmm. Paul, I'd like to jump into one of the pieces that you analyze in the book. And I've always kind of thought that there's a connection between good music writing and good sports writing. To a certain extent, music writing tells you this happened, then this happened, and then this person did such and such a thing, and then this happened. Your chapter on Roscoe Mitchell's Noneah is really like that. Now, Noneah is this piece that Roscoe's been working with for 50 years. He's done it solo, he's done it as quartet, he's done it for chamber orchestra with tubular bells, I think he told me. He's done it for full orchestra. It's basically, tell me if I'm wrong, but it's basically a couple of phrases, wide intervallic skips, up, down, it lands on, kind of pounces on this, is a G sharp at the bottom. Yeah. And in 1976, he goes to Willisau in Switzerland, the festival. Anthony Braxton has a major US recording contract. He's kind of a star, and he's supposed to be playing solo, and he can't make it. So Roscoe comes out, and there's this sort of psychological musical confrontation. And why don't you take it from there and tell everybody what happens?
Yeah, this is it's such a great story. And for Roscoe, it was pivotal because it not only was something that he had to contend with in the moment, but it just continued for decades, because the previous versions of Noneah had all been these sort of shorter pieces, as you said. But what he did is Roscoe at the time was working on a quartet version of Noneah for four alto saxophones, actually. And so he had been writing this piece while he was on tour with his group, the Art Ensemble of Chicago, which was also performing at the festival. He gets asked to fill in. He's not prepared to give a solo concert instead of Anthony Braxton, but he had this piece in his mind, in the days leading up to it. So he takes this saxophone quartet score up on the stage and just starts playing from it, from one of the phrases. And the audience was already kind of disappointed because Braxton wasn't there. Braxton's star was definitely on the rise. Roscoe's star was there, but at the time, Braxton was just ascending into the stratosphere. So the people start booing Roscoe as soon as he starts to play. And in fact, even before he plays the first note, they're already kind of jeering. And then he gets on, then he arrives at the microphone and has to really deal with this. So for Roscoe, he thought about it as something that he had to solve, but not kind of on a, not by, bantering with the audience, but by engaging with them musically. So he decides he's going to try to engage with them through sound, through this score and his interpretation of the score. And so he takes that opening phrase and then plays it again, and then a little differently. And he starts all these different techniques, all these different ways of varying this phrase. And at first people get even more upset. Then a few people kind of are won over. And then about 3 minutes in, people are going wild because they're seeing basically that he's going to keep developing this one phrase again and again, varying it just a little bit each time. And they're captivated. They may have been disappointed. According to the festival organizer, Nicholas Troxler, who gave me some great sort of stories about the performance too, it was about 50-50. Some people were open to Roscoe. Some people were just dead set against, so he had about 500 people to win over in the span of a few minutes. And, in that time, he does make it happen. So this is something that was pivotal for Roscoe because it showed him a new way to kind of engage with audience members musically, and it also influenced the way that he developed this piece. So every other version of Noneah really hinges on this one phrase that he sort of spontaneously chose to develop in this, jazz festival in 1976. And so the subsequent versions, whether it's the bassoon, flute, and piano trio, or for a cello ensemble, or the orchestral versions, are really all about what you can do with repetition and variation, the same techniques that he settled on in the moment, dealing with this hostile Swiss audience. You'd think that Swiss would be more neutral about things, but they were definitely not in this moment. But he found a way to deal with it musically, and it was a genius approach, and it continues to bear fruit, even today. And Noneah is kind of like a legendary piece now. A lot of ensembles have taken it on, a lot of soloists have taken it on. And I think the performance that everybody cites as really, turning them on to a new way to deal with music is this performance that we have from 1976. So this chapter in the book, it's chapter 2, is all about breaking down the way that Roscoe played this phrase 96 times and just made it work and won the audience over.
And you kind of describe it in a very, you can feel what's going on in the performance. It's almost like inning by inning. Variation 8, listen to the way he, alters the timbre of this phrase, listen to how he extends the final note by 4.2 seconds in variation 55. And you take us all through the 96, not one by one, but you hit on a whole bunch of them. And it seems to me that this is a really good illustration of AACM philosophy, doggedness, this idea that you can take one note, one phrase, one little cell, and go inside it and investigate the sound, turn it this way, turn it that way. It becomes a seed that it goes inward and it goes outward. And it seems like a really very telling example of what AACM people do.
I think it is. And it's that, just sticking to it, having that grit to keep working on something, even if the rewards are not immediately apparent.
Even if you're going to piss people off.
It may take you 40 years to win that MacArthur or something like that, but if you keep being great at being it just might happen for you. Roscoe's bandmate in the art ensemble, Famadou Don Moye, has this great quote. He's like, if you just keep occupying this position, eventually it will become apparent that you are the one occupying the position and the rewards will come. If you just keep doing your thing and doing it at a high level, good things will happen. And so for Roscoe, it's compressed in that 9 minutes, playing that phrase 96 times. There's one other thing I think that bears mentioning. This is a solo performance by Roscoe Mitchell, unaccompanied, but this is something that AACM members had been doing for 8 or 9 years at this point. This was a core element of AACM practice, getting up there with an instrument that's not traditionally a solo instrument, not a piano, not something like that, but an alto saxophone or a contrabass clarinet or a trumpet or some percussion, and just figuring out a way to make that solo performance thing work. It's going to push you in new directions with your composition. It's going to push you in new directions with your performance techniques on your instrument. And this is something that the AACM has really, taken to a new level individually and collectively. So I think that confidence also comes from having taken this really unusual musical practice. At least it was unusual at the time when the AACM folks started doing it and making it be just something else that they specialized in. Being able to make a compelling concert for an hour with just you and a horn, you and some percussion, whatever it might be, was another of their many, many contributions to 20th and 21st century music.
I once saw Roscoe play one note for half an hour. So it was at Sam Rivers Loft in Lower Manhattan. And some people were ticked off. And it was kind of like the Willishout thing. I mean, some people were gradually pulled in, others were not, but he just was relentless and did what he wanted to do. One thing that struck me in reading the book, chapter by chapter, all these great pieces by all these seminal people, is that there is not really, in a way there is an AACM sound, but in a way there isn't. I mean, there's so much variety in the music. Like, you begin with first or second chapter, Richard Abrams' Levels and Degrees of Light, which is that sort of twinkly, tinkly, kind of aleatory, atmospheric, quiet thing. But then you've got Henry Threadgill. You have a whole chapter on Threadgill and his trio Air, which sometimes is just swinging. I mean, they're like a jazz group, and the melody, the form is generally more apparent. You have a chapter on Fred Anderson, whose long open improvisations with the drummer Hammond Drake owe a lot to sort of that whole multi-directional music philosophy of Coltrane, to my ear. Chapter by chapter, I was just struck by the variety. George Lewis and his Voyager, which was this groundbreaking piece for human-computer interaction. Nicole Mitchell sometimes has funk grooves going and sometimes reminds me of Electric Miles Davis, or kind of thick, moody textures. I want to ask you, what are the linkages then? There's so much variety, and yet there must be some common threads, philosophies, vocabularies. What holds it together?
That's the $64,000 question. So I'm going to try my best. I may not get all the way there. I think one common element is thinking about ways to use improvisation and composition together, which is not to say that AACM members haven't written, fantastic pieces that are through composed. Every single note is on the score and you just play it. But in a lot of the pieces that are addressed in this book and that are, just out there in the AACM universe, there's this thought that composition and improvisation can do really interesting things together if we'll just let them, do what they do in a different way. There's definitely a concern with timbre, tone color, and sometimes you see that in the tendency toward multi-instrumentalism, people who play 20 different saxophones, clarinets, flutes, and other instruments. Other times you see that, preference for a diverse tone palette and just the type of instrumentation that you put together in an ensemble. So I think tone color is huge. I think composition and improvisation, doing things in new ways, new combinations. I think also something that Muhal would call extended forms, the idea that you can put together pieces with all these different elements and one thing can lead to something else and can lead to something else. I think the AACM developed ways of putting together musical forms in a way that was unanticipated by jazz artists or by experimental artists in the generations before. So these are just some of the things that show up in a lot of AACM pieces. And then there's just also the philosophy of creativity, original music, doing something that's from your own compositional system, from your own concept. That may be a thread. At the same time, we see one generation influencing the next generation. So you mentioned George Lewis's piece Voyager, which started out basically as a piece for a computer orchestra and then a human improviser interacting in real time. On one level, that looks like a computer music piece that belongs maybe in one category for contemporary music. But George's model for this piece was really the Experimental Band and the Art Ensemble of Chicago, groups that had all kinds of different instrumental combinations available to them and could really switch musical directions on a dime. So you can see one context to another context, but there's still some kind of continuity of thought, continuity of concept. So I hope that people, read the book and read every chapter and see those linkages for themselves. But I think timbral diversity, tone color, improvisation, and composition working together, and this concern for musical form, especially in an extended fashion, I think these are present in many, many different AACM pieces. They're top of mind for many different AACM composers, just to name a few.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you to kind of define and expand on what some of these key concepts and terms are. I made a list of them. I don't know if you want to do them one by one. I'll read you the list and you can pick and choose, but you just mentioned a couple of them. The use of little instruments where, 3 musicians might be playing 25 different instruments over the space of 5 minutes. Multi-instrumentalism, okay, related. Extended forms you just talked about. That's kind of a little bit of a vague term. What does that mean? Also, there are so many great terms: intensity structures, modular notations, structural sequences. Wadada Leo Smith talks about rhythm units and the spirit drum interaction of sound and rhythm. Why don't you just pick a few of those and tell people what they mean in your experience? What was it like to have them throw those terms at you and to have to respond as a bassist?
Well, I mean, the thing is, you got to learn by doing. So whether it's, Muwada Bowden talking about short subjects, you're going to improvise with just a couple of notes and then wait, pause. That's kind of the same concept of Wadada Leo Smith's rhythm units. Every sound has a silence that's attached. It should be approximately the same duration or import. So many different terms that are all kind of, because it's this AACM universe, all these things are often related, even though individuals may have their own terms and their own systems. Extended forms, I mentioned that before. I think what it is just the idea that instead of we're going to have one chorus that's 32 bars that repeats, or we're going to have one sonata form that has to do these 3 things in a particular order. We're going to combine all kinds of different ideas, musical styles, and structures in one long piece and see what happens, and have improvisation and composition appear in different proportions and sort of different interactions throughout the piece. That may be one way of defining extended forms. The extended form doesn't have to be an hour. It could be 11 really, really exciting and diverse minutes, but just the idea of, employing musical scale and form and all kinds of different sort of musical inputs. Intensity structures, You have a lot of instruments playing a lot of notes at the same time and not doing it in an imitative fashion, but everybody kind of pursues their own musical direction. Modular notation that you can, musical notation where you can start here and then go here or go somewhere else. You don't have to just read left to right. You probably said a few other things in there, but these are concepts invented by or developed in an individualized way by AACM composers. And there's some mutual influence. There's also some people who have highly personal systems that you really have to get into as a performer and collaborator over a period of years or even decades. But it just shows you the sort of depth of concept, depth of thought that's present when you have people pursuing their own direction and cultivating these systems and concepts over a period over very long periods of time. You can really get to some new sounds, new music, when you have all these things you're trying to do, all these things that you're inspired by your colleagues to do. So some terms, this is not really a glossary portion of the chat, but there's a lot in here. At the same time, it all comes basically from AACM members' interviews with me or with other people from their own writings. So I think it's pretty well documented and I think explained in a pretty cogent way. So you can see how this term applies to this or that piece.
Of course, Braxton's scores are famous or infamous. They're beautiful and amazing, and they're visual and they're almost like 3D. Can you look at those scores and a Braxton score and sort of immediately see into the music and have a sense of what's going on? Sometimes, or what the possibilities are?
Sometimes, and other times you can't. Wadada Leo Smith has a great story about being in a rehearsal with Braxton and Leroy Jenkins in the late 60s. And one of them had brought a score. I forget whether it was Wadada or Anthony, but one of them had brought this score, this beautiful score, and they played it, and then, as was the custom for many AACM musicians in this period, they recorded their performance and then listened back immediately afterward. And they discovered that they could not at all hear where they were. At other times, and this was my experience when, breaking down this Anthony Braxton piece, Composition 76, which is the subject of Chapter 3, took me a little bit to find where I was at. But then at some point, the light bulb went on, and I was able to see how this shape and these alphanumeric codes and this contour and this color led Henry Threadgill to play this or Douglas Stewart to play that. So I think you just have to put in the time, just like anything else. And there's often a path through it. There's often some listening strategies that you can employ. But I think for me, it just really helped to be, a collaborator with a lot of AACM artists and kind of have some working knowledge, not just of their writings and their interviews, but also, being in a rehearsal studio, being on the bandstand, being on stage, kind of knowing how things might work. That gave me a leg up maybe. But there's a lot in here, and then a lot we also just have to get through listening. One of the most gratifying things about writing the Wadada Leo Smith chapter, where I talk about his wonderful suite, 10 Freedom Summers, is I pay a special attention to his piece, his tribute to Emmett Till. And I got the score from Wadada. It's a pile of music. And I focused on this one piece, and I spent months, trying to understand this piece, to the greatest extent that I could. Then I sent the chapter to Wadada, and he was like, the 4 moments that are your moments are the same moments for me. Those are the focal points of this movement for me too. And so even though he and I didn't have an exchange about the piece, I just was kind of in the lab with it for a period of months. And I came out with basically an interpretation that really matched what he wanted the audience to get out of it, So moments like that, interactions like that, are really, really, really great to let me know that I might be on the right track with some of these pieces, and that I hope the reader too can, get a sense of what this piece is meant to do, what it's meant to convey, to the listener.
That's wonderful. How long did you work on this book, Paul? Like, how many years did it take you?
This is about a 3-year project, start to finish. You kind of have to write every day or almost every day. You have to put in a lot of time studying scores, listening, transcribing. There's a lot of transcriptions. They don't necessarily show up in the book, but they're, part of the work input. So yeah, it's just it was my life for a few years, but in a way it'd been my life for 20 years before that anyhow. So to get into these pieces, I wasn't coming to it completely de novo. I kind of was immersed in the AACM world for a while. And when it came time to write this book, close to about a 3-year trajectory of getting into piece after piece, album after album, and figuring out what I wanted to feature in the book, and then just spending time with these pieces.
I'm curious, how much time do you think went into your breakdown of Noneah, of the 96 variations of Noneah? How many times did you listen to that performance?
Well, I spent a lot of time, looping one phrase after another phrase to figure out what was going on in these 9 notes this time versus the next time Roscoe played the 9 notes. So the transcription phase of that was a few weeks of intense effort, just making sure I got every single note right, sending the transcription to Roscoe, kind of getting his blessing about it, and then thinking about the strategies that Roscoe is using in the moment to compose out how you can do one phrase 96 times. And then there's more to the piece after that. There's a couple of sections that follow, but that was some serious listening and transcribing. You get into this nice loop space where you're just hearing this one phrase, maybe for 20 minutes, you're just on this one phrase, then you go to the next one. So, my mind did some interesting things when I was listening to that piece, loop and repeat. But it was, just fascinating to kind of be transported back to Willisau, Switzerland in 1976 and hear the way Roscoe is engaging with the audience, see the way he's interacting with the score that's on the music stand right in front of him, and then trying to capture that in notation and ultimately in my own hearing and writing about the piece.
I have other questions here, but we are also 50 minutes into this. So you tell me what you want to do. Do you want to continue like this, or do you want to open it to the listeners? How do you want to do it?
Let's see what Jonathan says, because Jonathan has been fielding all these questions. If there are some good questions already, maybe throw in a good one, Jonathan.
Well, absolutely. I have questions, but I was going to mention that I think we can fit in about 5 more minutes of your conversation. And then, yes, some questions have come in, and I know I have at least one question that I want to ask myself. So please continue. And I'll come in about 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, one thing that I did want to say in relation to Roscoe Mitchell, Paul, was that, in all this conversation about terminology, intensity structures, modular notation, whatever it is, it sounds really cerebral and maybe hard to get your head around. But then what I always love is the sense of humor and the earthiness that comes in, like Roscoe in the middle of a piece blowing a whistle. Like, that's it, move on, time to stop, do something else. So it's this very interesting mixture of attitudes and approaches.
Yeah, and I mean, you hear that in Roscoe's music from the very beginning, from his album Sound 1966. There's seriousness, and then there's just completely wild concepts of what sound can follow the next sound, can follow the next sound. His longtime art ensemble bandmate, Lester Bowie, has an album called Serious Fun. And to me, that's one of the things that the AACM is all about. You're going to do what you do to a high level, but it's really about creativity, and creativity is about play. And it's about being there in the moment. It's about opening your mind to absolutely anything that could happen, in a performance or while you're composing in that space. And the AACM has opened, so many other musicians' minds. I had a conversation about a week ago with the great flutist, Wilfredo Terrazas, and he and I discovered that we had the exact same reaction to the exact same art ensemble piece. Probably within a few years of each other, we were listening to the album Full Force, and the long percussion introduction to Malachi Favor's piece, Mag Zelma, where there's all this metallic percussion, bells and glockenspiels and gongs and triangles and chimes and all these different things. And we both discovered, Wilfredo and I, that when we'd been listening heavily to this piece, for me it was around the year 2000, 2001, that we had been doing like these ordinary things. In my case, it was literally washing dishes in my little apartment in Chicago. And I heard 2 things clank together underneath the water. And I was like, that sounded just like what Malachi Favors and Don Moyer were doing, in the recording studio in New York, with Manfred Eicher from ECM listening. And so just, being open to all these different levels of creativity, all these different types of sonic combinations, that's creative, that's fun, that's being in the moment. And that's what the AACM has done for themselves and for so many of us who are fortunate, to study with them or just, listen to the music and learn, even from some old albums or from CDs, whatever it might be. That's one of the, many important things they've accomplished. And, so that's why I had to write this book, because they've done a lot for me and for a lot of other people. And I just want to share some of my takes on the music, some of what I think is going on in these really wonderful pieces.
I like how you describe it as an offering to the organization and all these people. Do you think you would have become a musician had you not been ultimately accepted to Mwada Boden's ensemble?
I was already a musician, but I would have been a very, very different kind of musician. I shudder to think where I would be at right now. It'd be something less interesting, I can guarantee that. And not everything that I do now sounds like AACM, but that spirit is always there. And I would definitely be a different musician, definitely be a different person. I'd be a different writer, a different teacher, different a lot of things if it hadn't been for Mwada and Fred and George, Malachi Thompson and Alvin Fielder and Joseph Jarman and Roscoe Mitchell and all these great people who were part of my life.
Jonathan, do you want to jump in now, or?
Yeah, let's get to some questions. There have been a few questions that came in, a few questions at a time from one person. So I'm going to do my best to try to choose one or two from each person, and then we can circle back around. But at random, I have a question here. This is from Bob and towards Paul. There's an interesting interplay, I think, between the scores, the performances, and then the recorded record of all these performances. Levels and degrees of light seems to me like a case in point, since the reverberation seems really core to the piece. Any thoughts about the score, the performance, and then the documentation when it's not a quote live recording?
Yeah, I mean, there's also this question of how many recordings that are even marketed and billed as live recordings are actually live fully in that way. But I think for me, a piece like Levels and Degrees of Light, both the track and then the album as a whole, are exactly representative of this kind of interplay between a musical concept and then the players that Muhal selects, because there's a different ensemble on each of the 3 tracks on this album. Then these sort of studio techniques that Muhal brings in after the fact. There's this idea, and then it's shaped by these musicians, then reshaped by Muhal in the post-production process. And then, then it goes on from there. So I think the reverb on that album as a whole and some specific moments in particular is really innovative. It represents something you can't put in the score, something you can't tell your musicians to do because it's just going to factor in later. But it just shows the vision that Muhal and a lot of other AACM figures have had. There are not too many so-called jazz labels doing the sort of things that Delmark allowed the AACM to do in the 60s, but for the most part, they let the AACM folks have free reign, which is really, really notable for a music that didn't seem to have obvious commercial implications at the time, but they made it work. They did some new things, and we have Levels of Degrees of Light and so many other fascinating pieces. This is something I don't talk about in every chapter, but many AACM members have really gone deep with electronic music or computer music in a lot of different ways. This is another, I think, strain of their contribution to the musical universe.
Okay, wonderful. I want to let everyone know that this question time period will be about 10 minutes, so feel free to keep putting them in. This question comes from Robert. How did Nicole Mitchell bridge the gap between the old guard and her contributions to the AACM?
I think she did it by becoming a leader in her own right. She joined the AACM in 1995, 30 years after it had been founded. There was not a lot of new blood in the organization at the time, but she became that new blood, and she worked very diligently and consciously to sort of, bring older and newer members together. She also inducted many, many new people younger than her into the organization. So I think for me in the 21st century, she's really that essential figure who has sort of taken the AACM to that next level and bringing that next generation up. Also Ernest Dawkins and Chicago brought 25 new fantastic musicians into the collective. But Nicole, I think, has been a really, really crucial player. I think because of the people that she studied with when she came into the AACM, people who were in many cases there almost from the beginning, she was able to learn at the feet of people who had learned from Muhal, people who had learned from Roscoe, and then translate that in her own way to people who came after her. So I think for her, it was just about wanting to be a leader, wanting to absorb sort of early AACM and wanting to pass it on, to her sort of her peers and her, her trainees, her mentees in her own individual and unique way. So it was all about being conscious of that leadership, being conscious of mentorship in much the same way that Muhal did just 30 years later with some different people in the room.
All right. This question comes from Donna. Is there anything else you would have written for the book that maybe you had to forgo during the editing process?
Yeah, I mean, definitely this book is 9 chapters long. It could have been 18 chapters long. There are so many other pieces that I thought about, including so many other, individuals I would have liked to feature. Sometimes it was just a matter of, what scores I had access to, or what I thought would translate well to the written medium. But I think there could easily be, another book like this. I'm not promising volume 2, but I know I'm just scratching the surface. It could be me, it could be some other people that come along after, and just keep going with it. There's so much to say about the AACM, and I just hope that me or someone else makes it happen. But I tried to be balanced, tried to include a lot of different people, tried to include a lot of different, tendencies and contributions. And I hope it works. I think it does. But yeah, so many things, so many people, so many, albums, so many compositions that could have been in there. So not necessarily regrets, but just you can always write a book in a different way. And there's a lot more to be said about this. This book only scratches the surface because there's 100 or more AACM members doing great things, and you could write volumes and volumes and volumes.
All right. Could you mention the role of Roosevelt College, now called Roosevelt University, and what about the African American nationalism in the 1960s?
Yeah, there's so many institutions in Chicago, especially on the South Side, that were home, whether for a semester or several years, to AACM musicians. So people like Anthony Braxton studied philosophy and music composition at Roosevelt. Many AACM musicians were enrolled at Wilson Junior College, which is now Kennedy King College. Braxton was there too. People in the 70s studied at Governor State University. So all these educational institutions, usually if it wasn't the entire music department or the entire philosophy department, had like one renegade there who was, showing people some new things, doing things in different ways. So a lot of these institutions deserve a shout out. People at the University of Chicago as well, Malcolm X Junior College on the West Side, so many places. Also, the question also mentioned African American nationalism. This, of course, is at its height in the 1960s, both the political nationalism brand as well as the cultural nationalism. The AACM is very much a part of African American cultural nationalism, the idea of sort of taking inspiration from Black culture in the US and from around the world and making that the focus, the sort of centerpiece of the aesthetic. This is very much a part of the AACM in the 60s. At the same time, the AACM always had sort of this global sort of scope. I don't mean global as an opposition to African American or to the African diaspora, but we have people in the AACM who are listening to literally everything from around the globe. In chapter 4, which is the chapter about Henry Threadgill's Air, there's a piece in there that's inspired by Japanese music that Threadgill used to hear in the 60s and 70s in Chicago. Then he kind of develops his own spin on it for saxophone, percussion, bass, and drums ensemble. So the AACM contains multitudes, like a lot of other great things out there, and cultural nationalism of the African American variety is definitely part of it in the 60s. But the AACM had its ears to all kinds of grounds inside and outside of the South Side. So the AACM is is many things. African American cultural nationalism is definitely part of it, and some of the other things factor in even early on, and certainly in the 21st century. Nicole Mitchell's Mandorla Awakening is another, which is the final chapter of the book, is another great example of that. This is a book, actually comes from a novella that Nicole wrote that is inspired by the work of Octavia Butler and by Afrofuturism, but there's also Japanese instruments and Middle Eastern instruments and electronics and all these different things that are part of the ensemble that she assembles. So when we talk about Black nationalism in the AACM, there's also this absolute Catholicity of reference that I think is core to how the AACM interpreted what it means to be a part of the tradition of great Black music.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to try to fit in two more, but this one kind of comes in as a double. So we're just going to categorize this as one because I really want to know the answer. Uh, are there any distinctions to be made between the NOLA style of improv and writing in the style of AACM Chicago with the approach? This question comes from John.
Yeah. So if you're talking about NOLA as in New Orleans, Louisiana, that's a very old tradition, one that's still very much ongoing. There are some AACM members with roots in Louisiana, or people like Alvin Fielder that studied down there for periods of time, and I think brought some of those sounds, especially styles of drum and percussion playing, to Chicago. I think when I think of the early art ensemble of Chicago and the way that they, thought about collective improvisation, I think there's a little bit of New Orleans in there too, and not just because Alvin Fielder was one of the first drummers, in that group. I think anytime you have music that's about sort of collective expression and about instruments doing things in new ways, whether it's bringing a vocal technique to the way you play trumpet like Lester Bowie did in a way that was very much like some of the early New Orleans trumpeters. Anytime you have ensembles that are, sort of creating new roles and new sounds for each instrument, I think your mind can definitely go back to New Orleans. But for the art ensemble and other AAC musicians, there's just everything is always potentially present. You can go from something that sounds like New Orleans style music to something that could sound like a 19th century march, to something that could sound like sort of Renaissance consort music. That could all be in the same piece, and it is in Roscoe Mitchell's The Little Suite from his album Sound. So, collective improvisation in all kinds of different styles and registers is crucial to a lot of AACM music. Of course, there's compositional inputs, there's notation, there's all kind of other things in there too. But that kind of group improvisation and that just kind of let it all go spirit is definitely there in a lot of this stuff.
All right. I'm going to throw in one more only because just a few days ago, my colleague and I at City Lights, we were playing Sun Ra's film, Space is the Place. We were playing it for everyone, all of our customers to hear. Kim wants to know, was there any relationship between AACM and Sun Ra?
Yeah, I think there were a few connections. I mean, there are definitely some AACM members, Phil Coran, Malachi Favors, Alvin Fielder, who played briefly with Sun Ra. None of those individuals became long-term members of the Sun Ra Orchestra, but there were definitely a lot of folks on the South Side who passed through Sun Ra's band. Somebody in the chat mentions Alvin Fielder. Yeah, Alvin did a few gigs with him, I think in the 57, 58, somewhere around there. So Sun Ra employed a lot of people on the South Side for about a 10-year period, including some future AACM members. And there are definitely some overlaps between the way that Sun Ra did things and the way the AACM did things. I think Sun Ra is someone who was much like Muhal, an innovator in different ways of leading a band, different ways of using notation and also conducting symbols to elicit new types of sounds, from these big improvising ensembles. Definitely the idea that you could be a musician and also look into all kinds of different, intellectual and historical, literary, artistic spaces. There's an overlap there. Somebody in the chat says dramatic presentation, whether that's costuming or poetry. There are definitely some overlaps, but also, the AACM is kind of a world unto itself. And so whether it's with the experimental band or all the other ensembles that followed, you see all kinds of other techniques and traditions developing very much on their own. But many AACM musicians have been influenced by Sun Ra over the years. Nicole Mitchell is another contemporary, example of that. She's lectured about, Sun Ra's concepts, brought some of his concepts into her music. But there's also this AACM tradition that is kind of a thing unto itself. So some overlaps. It's not one leads into the other. It's just people on the South Side doing creative things, in the 50s, 60s, and beyond.
Hey, Jonathan, could I ask one more question?
Absolutely, please.
Paul, I was wondering if you could tell us how we can hear your compositions or your bass playing. I mean, I know you've recorded, you were telling me a little bit about your activities as a bassist, even today in St. Louis. Who do you play with? What kind of music do you play? And how can we listen?
Well, if you want to listen, you can go to my website, which is just my name, paulsteinbeck.com. That's also the place you should go when you are reading sound experiments. You should go to paulsteinbeck.com/AV, where you can listen to literally every single piece discussed in this book. Elsewhere on that website, there are links to all of my recordings. with different kinds of ensembles from Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. Right now I'm working with a lot of gospel musicians. I was supposed to back up Kira Sheard last week, and her travel schedule changed, so we couldn't make that happen, but I operate in that field. I also play a lot of experimental music with people like Jim Haggerty, who's a longtime collaborator with the AACM composer Douglas Ewart. I work a lot with the drummer and percussionist Del Robles, who's kind of like a South Texas AACM cat because of all the different percussion instruments that he brings to bear. So so please go to my website if you want to hear a little bit of what I've done. You can find me on YouTube as well, but I think paulsteinbeck.com is a great place to start. And definitely for learning these pieces in more detail. Definitely go there, listen to listen to the music for each chapter as you read, and it should be a kind of a nice multimedia experience.
All right. Well, with that being said, let me give a quick thank you to you both, Richard and Paul, for your time. Your presence is not taken lightly, and I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. To our audience, I want to remind everyone that City Lights is open for your business every Monday through Thursday, 11 a.m. to 8 p.m., and Friday through Sunday, 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. This event was made possible by the support from the City Lights Foundation. With that, let me say a thank you to you all again for coming out tonight. We've enjoyed having you. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you to you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Bye.